Welcome to the Grizzly Beat, a podcast of Grizzly Times and Louisa Wilcox, where we interview scientific experts, managers, Native Americans, writers, and others to share their knowledge, perspectives, and experience. This comes at a time of enormous interest in the grizzly bear's future as the government proposes to remove federal protections, and citizens are asking important questions. We hope the information shared here will help listeners shape their own answers. Welcome to Grizzly Times podcast. My name is Louisa Wilcox, and I'm here today with Nick Arrivo with the Humane Society of the United States. Nick is an attorney who specializes in the environment and animal welfare. And right now, Nick is taking on an important case challenging the premature removal of federal endangered species protections for Yellowstone grizzly bears, or delisting. Nick is a writer and a poet in whatever spare time he has that's not consumed by Trump's anti-environmental crusade. So welcome, Nick.
Thanks, Louisa. It's great to be here.
Before talking about grizzly delisting, I wanted to ask you about your early years. So growing up outside Chicago, you decided at a fairly young age to be a vegan, and still are. What prompted you to make that choice?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think there were a couple of things. Sort of one kind of emotional and the other more intellectual, I would say. The first, when I was maybe 9 or so, I was on my way home driving with my dad back from my grandparents' house, and that side of the family lives up in rural southwestern Wisconsin, and we were on some county road. It was winter, but it wasn't snowing, and the sky was clear. And there were these sort of white flakes kind of falling onto the windshield of the car, and I was confused. At first I thought it was snowing from a clear sky, but then I looked a little closer and realized that they were actually feathers, and there was a huge flatbed truck in front of us on this road that was carrying probably 1,000 broiler chickens in battery cages exposed to the elements on a really cold Wisconsin day, just flying down the highway with feathers flying off. And I didn't really understand what, CAFOs were or how the industrial agriculture system operated at that time, but that was a disturbing, visceral moment for me. And I feel like that knocked something a little bit loose. A couple of years later then, I was in high school, and I was interested in, pretentious, quasi-intellectual, adolescent boy things. I was reading Camus and reading a little basic philosophy, and I picked up Peter Singer's Animal Liberation, and that book just, as is the case for a lot of people, I think, it really opened my eyes. And I read it cover to cover in a weekend, I think, and kind of concluded that, there's really no way for me to consider myself an ethical person or to, kind of live with myself if I don't try to act on my principles here. And then I went vegan. And, it was difficult in the Midwest, especially at first. In the 90s, we didn't have the excellent vegan options that exist today. Non-dairy cheese was still this disgusting orange plasticky substance, but things have come a long way, I think, and it's really not a problem anymore. Even traveling in the Rockies and through rural parts of the country, I never have too much trouble.
So before you settled on the law, Nick, you started a career in publishing, focused on ecology as well as poetry. How has your love of poetry influenced your approach to animal protection and, more recently, your work in the law?
I don't think there's, like a direct connection. I've never been, like a romantic or like deeply interested in, like the American transcendentalists and that sort of school of literature that sort of deifies nature in a certain way. I like it and respect it, but it's not what I really feel. I think at a base level, what it is it just sort of cultivates a certain sensitivity, I guess, for lack of a better word, a kind of appreciation for non-instrumental value in things, which to me naturally leads one to appreciating other forms of life, whether they be, animals or just broader ecosystems. It kind of broadens your perspective out from the utilitarian demands of human civilization a little bit. As far as the law is concerned, I mean, I think that poetry and legal writing are about as far apart as any two forms of writing can possibly be. And it's been a difficult transition, I think. I mean, as you know, you've read a lot of legal materials over the years, and it's like generally very bad writing, very dull writing. They sort of in law school do their best to kind of beat the sense of style out of you, and train you to write in these, formulaic paragraphs. And, I think some of that is necessary. I think you have to be linear and you have to be clear and concise. But I find that, I enjoy the work of legal drafting, and I think judges and other attorneys appreciate reading legal materials that still have a voice. I think it's important. If you read like the best Supreme Court advocates, for instance, something that they all have in common, whether they're on the right or the left, is that they don't really write like other kind of line attorneys do. There is more of a voice. There's a sense of narrative that kind of flows through. And so I guess that's if you can take some seed away from, literature and incorporate it into legal practice, it's got to be that.
Interesting. So, Nick, you've been watching wildlife for many years now, but more recently you've taken an interest in mushrooms. How did you get interested in mushrooms, and what's it like being a mycologist in the urban heart of Washington?
I got interested. It was a couple of years ago. I was on a camping trip out in the George Washington National Forest, a couple hours west of here, and I was on a hike with a couple of my friends and a couple of dogs, and I think it was the day after a rain in the late summer, and we came upon this sort of prairie area that had what had to have been probably 100 pounds of these beautiful kind of apricot-colored mushrooms. And I was certain they were chanterelles. And at that point, I was not, a mushroom hunter at all. I had not read any texts. I could not tell you what a spore print was, or the difference between an amanita and an agaricus. But, as a vegetarian and a vegan, I definitely ate a lot of mushrooms in my time. I lived through the 1990s when, portobellos were pretty much all I could eat at any restaurant. And I was pretty sure these were chanterelles, and that we had just encountered, thousands of dollars worth of premium, high-quality mushrooms out in the wilderness that, could feed us well through the winter. But, not knowing enough about it and being cautious and not wanting to, poison my entire camping group, I did not pick them, did not try to cook them. But then I went and, got a couple of books from the library and read up so that this wouldn't happen again. And I've since, gotten really into the hobby. I think it's a great way to, get out into nature with kind of a focus and a sense of purpose. And I think it forces you to pay attention to, forms of life that are maybe a little less sexy, that aren't at eye level, There's like an incredible diversity of life, underneath the leaves and along the roots of trees that if you aren't looking for it, you don't really notice. But once you start, it's just this entire sort of alien kingdom of life that has been right there all along. And D.C. is a surprisingly good place for it, actually.
Interesting.
There's a rich substrate of bullshit here, as you know, and so the mushrooms grow very well. But no, in seriousness, there are really good, urban parks around here, and they're not too picked over, and it's very possible to find a huge diversity of mushrooms and meet other people that are doing the same thing while you're out.
That's great. So, Nick, you went to law school at Yale, and there you got involved in the law clinic and took on a case involving international whaling, which was kind of an entree to work on animal rights issues. What lessons did you learn that you've been able to apply to your ongoing work with the Humane Society?
Well, I wish I could say that I learned Icelandic, because it would have been really helpful deciphering some of those corporate and legal documents that we had to work on in that case. It was sort of an investigation and potential sort of movement for sanctions against this Icelandic fishing conglomerate that is one of the few companies in the world that still engages in commercial whaling. But, I think the main thing I took away from that, and I think it's a lesson that, lawyers that are involved in movements in general, should be aware of and will learn quickly if they're not, is that litigation is certainly a powerful tool sometimes, but it's not the only tool in the toolbox. Legal skills and legal training can enable you to support campaigns and support activists and kind of push the ball forward using other mechanisms. And whether that is, non-binding kind of international arbitration bodies like we were working with in this case, or whether that is, shareholder pressure or, petitions to rulemaking agencies, things like that, you're not taking someone to court, but you are still, amplifying the voices and the power of the grassroots and of the organizations that you're representing. I think litigation has its moments when it's necessary and when it's very potent, but the input to output ratio is not always the best, let's say. And so I think it's important to keep in mind, all of the other things that lawyers can do and can help you do when you're kind of working on a campaign.
Well, maybe the issue of the international fur trade might be along the lines of how one works outside of litigation. You've been involved in that and the phenomenon of faux fur. So maybe you can explain what faux fur is and what you're trying to achieve in your work.
Yeah, so, obviously fur and the fur trade and fur apparel has been, a traditional focus of the animal welfare, animal protection, animal rights, whatever you want to call it, movement for decades now. I think it's a very visible form of animal cruelty. It's, I think it shocks the conscience a little more than even factory farming does, just by virtue of the fact that it's so facially unnecessary, and also because it has these kind of associations with decadent luxury and, Cruella de Vil type villains.
Yeah, right.
And I think, sort of like, we're seeing with the rise of clean meat and, advanced plant-based proteins now, there have been really remarkable advances in faux fur. It's not just, cheap plastic stuff around the collar of your coat anymore. There are textiles that are being made and used by, really highly regarded designers that kind of mimic the warmth and the feel and the style of fur. And, I think that is part of our campaign that the Humane Society is doing is kind of working with retailers, working with fashion houses to transition them away from the use of animal fur and sort of toward the use of cruelty-free alternatives. I think, fur is a particularly important issue to me because it kind of stands at the intersection of, wildlife and farmed animals. I think, industrial factory farms are one of the most, horrifying creations of human civilization, and the idea of taking that level of confinement and cruelty and subjecting animals like foxes or mink that are, just as capable of suffering as pigs and chickens and cows are, but on top of that are fundamentally wild animals whose instincts are being, repressed to a degree that is driving them insane in those conditions is just reprehensible, and for luxury fashion. And so we've had a lot of success on these campaigns recently. in the past year, we've gotten commitments from Prada and from Armani and from Michael Kors, sort of huge global brands, to phase fur out of their entire lines by date certain. And so that's been tremendous. I think the tide is really pushing back.
That's great. On a different note, you've also taken on predator management in New Mexico, including trapping of mountain lions. You've also worked to protect very endangered Mexican wolves. And these have confronted you with the role of hunters in state wildlife management. Why do you think hunters pose such a serious threat to the protection of predators?
So it's an interesting question because, predators, at least mountain lions and most predators, are not typically considered trophy game species. When you think of big game, it's elk or it's deer, and it's not a mountain lion. And so, on its face, it seems like there shouldn't be an obvious conflict. But what we're seeing in New Mexico, what we've seen in Colorado and Alaska, are these kind of state-sanctioned, euphemistically titled predator control programs where there are kind of deliberate efforts to what they would say manage, I would say, eradicate or decimate natural predator populations in an attempt to artificially inflate the availability of prey species that those animals would otherwise prey upon. And those are the trophy game animals. And so I think where the conflict comes from most directly is that big game hunters are in competition with predators to kill the same game species. And, predators are good at it and have evolved to do it for a much longer time than hunters have been hunting. And so, in order to maintain enough of a supply of trophy game species, you have hunters in conjunction with state wildlife agencies kind of deliberately culling coyotes, mountain lions, wolves, bears, even in Alaska, and that is not sound wildlife management. It's not driven by a sort of scientific or ecological approach. It is really just the sort of venal, naked interest of the hunters in hunting and in the state agency and maintaining those relationships, acquiring additional income through the sales of tags. It's a bad system, and what is particularly difficult about it, I think, is the politics around state wildlife management, especially in western states. It's difficult to break into if you are, a conservation organization, or if you are just an individual citizen who is strongly invested in, non-consumptive use of wildlife or natural resources. And a lot of that is because, fish and game commissions, which are appointed by the governor and not elected and therefore not accountable to the broader public, are kind of standing at the highest level of decision-making in these states. But I think also it's where the money's coming from. I think it's kind of an underappreciated fact that more than half of most state game agency budgets is actually coming through the federal government, through the Fish and Wildlife Service, because of this statute called the Pittman-Robertson Act that creates an excise tax on the sale of all firearms and ammunition, and then distributes that on sort of a pro rata basis to the 50 states for what they say is wildlife management and restoration, but what in practice is operating the state game agencies for the benefit of consumptive users. And because the source of that funding is tied to firearm sales and ammunition sales, there is kind of this built-in obligation or constituency that these states, are sort of beholden to, and there's nothing comparable. You have like certain conservation plates or something like that, but that's just a drop in the bucket, I think, compared to the funding stream that's coming directly from, hunters and sports people. And so I think you can, argue all you want and show up at meetings and present incredibly detailed and well thought out positions, but I think it's going to be very difficult to fight against that just naked financial interests until that law changes or until there's another source of sustainable funding for these state agencies that does not come from hunting.
Right, and we're seeing the anti-carnivore sentiment of the states in the Northern Rockies and the hunting community in the Northern Rockies play out on the grizzly bear delisting issue, which you're very involved in, representing the Humane Society in a lawsuit again to try to get grizzly bears relisted in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that case and what you're doing to raise central concerns in court.
Yeah, so I'm sure your listeners and your readers are, fairly aware of the sort of saga over the past couple of years since the proposal to remove threatened status from Yellowstone grizzlies came out in early 2016 through June of last year when it was finalized. And I am representing the Humane Society, which is one of a large kind of coalition of tribal conservation and animal protection groups that are all challenging this delisting rule. I think there are a lot of serious flaws in both just the delisting, but also the way that they approach the delisting. And the lawsuit raises a lot of claims that I think are all very strong and viable. I think there are sort of three categories, I guess. The first is their kind of misuse of what's called the distinct population segment portion of the Endangered Species Act, which is a tool that allows the Fish and Wildlife Service to kind of define a subspecies level population of animals as its own kind of discrete unit for the purposes of listing or delisting. And so this is what allows them to kind of carve a circle around Yellowstone and say, this is the Yellowstone population. We're going to remove protections here, but leave it, at least for now, in the rest of, the glacier ecosystem or the northern Cascades. And I think and we can talk about this more later on, I think. I don't want to get too into the legal nitty-gritty on that right now, but I think there are major legal problems with the way that they've invoked that provision. I think the second category is state management and its inadequacy in a world where there are no federal protections. Now that grizzly bears in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem are no longer listed as threatened, they are under the management of the respective Yellowstone states, Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming, except obviously in the parks. And to put it mildly, the protections that the states are offering these animals under their laws and regulations are not anywhere near what existed before and are, woefully inadequate to even ensure a stable population, let alone avoid a crash that will, potentially necessitate an emergency action of some kind to return these animals to the threatened species list before it's too late. And I think, the service knew that the states were doing a pretty poor job throughout the entire process and kind of looked the other way while the states went through regulatory processes that, were legally and substantively just pretty poor. The most important component of which, of course, is the plan to allow trophy hunting, and certainly in Wyoming and likely in the other two states as well. And then the last kind of category of legal arguments that are on the table here are of a more scientific nature, and these are about the service's failure to account for the ongoing threats to the survival of this population. So as you know much better than I do, during the last attempt to delist this population of grizzly bears, federal courts in the District of Montana and then the Ninth Circuit overturned that decision on the basis of most relevantly, the service's failure to account for the precipitous loss in whitebark pine availability, which is a staple food source for grizzly bears in this ecosystem. And this time around, they've jumped through a lot of hoops to sort of paper over that mistake in an attempt to, placate the Ninth Circuit's holding. But I think in doing so, they missed a lot of the sort of secondary implications of the loss of that food source. And so even though, they say, for instance, in the final rule that, well, grizzly bears have been able to disperse further outward where they're, shifting their diet to a higher proportion of meat, let's say, they don't then consider the implications of that outward dispersal and that increasing reliance on other food sources for, human conflict, because they are, moving further out from the primary conservation area of the park in order to obtain these other food sources. And so I think the service took one step but did not take the next step, I think, which would have, shown that the mere fact that they, are omnivores and can shift to other food sources doesn't mean that the fact that they're doing so means they're sort of secure in the long term.
Right, and there's consequences to a heavy meat diet, which we're seeing with more conflicts as bears, come in on hunter-killed elk and livestock. So it's not without a price.
Absolutely, and there are other factors here as well. I mean, as you've done a really good job documenting, that there's been record levels of both overall and human-caused mortality for the last 2 years, and sort of that trend was sort of disturbingly absent from the service's analysis in the delisting rule. It kind of arbitrarily cut off its time frame at 2014, which, conveniently for them, allowed them to ignore the difficult fact that there are more bears dying every year.
Mm-hmm. And certainly Wyoming plans to add to that mortality with their proposed hunt. We just heard this week that Wyoming is going to. Yeah. So what's the Humane Society? What are you going to do about it?
Well, I think that, we're in litigation now, and the proposed hunt would not begin until the fall of 2018 at the earliest. And so I think ideally the lawsuit will succeed quickly, and the rule will be vacated, and grizzly bears in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem will be returned to the federal list of threatened species such that season will never be able to start. Of course, litigation, as you know, can operate on unpredictable timetables, and there are delays built into things, and sometimes the government shuts down and DOJ is no longer able to, file its briefs in time. And so that, there are questions about how quickly things will proceed, but should we come to a point where, and I'm sorry for using this, but where we're staring down the barrel of that hunting season, I think there are certain emergency measures that may need to be taken in order to prevent that from happening.
Well, we wish you the best of luck with that, and grizzly bears very much need it. The additional protections again. So, but the grizzly bear delisting issue has raised other issues with the Endangered Species Act, which has come under increasing fire these days in this fiercely anti-environmental Congress and administration. Maybe you can share some of your concerns about the Endangered Species Act itself, and perhaps what some of the listeners can do to protect the bill.
Absolutely. Well, so I think at the legislative level, what we're seeing now is Congress sort of making it their business to intervene in listing and delisting decisions on a species-by-species level through legislation, often through appropriations riders even, that not even standalone bills, but just sneaky little two-sentence riders that are snuck in without, opportunity for real full debate and consideration. And, I mean, it's likely within Congress's power to do this, of course, but I think, they're not doing it on grounds that are based on the best available science. It is entirely contrary to the spirit of the ESA, which delegates this authority to the Secretary of the Interior, so that expert scientists, expert biologists can study and make determinations about what needs to be done. And I think it's a terrible precedent to set when politics starts to interfere in what needs to be a scientific decision-making process. But I think also what we're seeing is, and this is I think part of the broader kind of deregulatory frenzy of this administration, is just a view that the ESA and listing in general is viewed as kind of a regulatory hurdle, that it's an impediment to energy development and to other kind of consumptive or extractive uses of federal lands, and that those roadblocks need to be cleared in order to generate more wealth or otherwise kind of exploit the resources that exist. And this is an area that I think is really threatening. This administration, blessedly, I guess, hasn't had a ton of success pushing new affirmative legislation through. But one area where, there has been a lot of activity and a lot of things have been done is in the repeal of regulations, or the kind of stalling out of the issuance of important new regulations. And so that's a place where the ESA is, I think, under attack right now as well. Mm-hmm. And it's a difficult situation, I think, because it's sort of like a classic collective action problem, I guess, where the benefits of the ESA accrue widely to all of society, all of the world, really, mm-hmm. And the number of people that are touched and benefited by the protections that are afforded endangered species just vastly outnumbers the sort of costs or the benefit to people that would accumulate if ESA protections were cut. But because it's such a diffuse set of beneficiaries that really care about this issue, and because the people that want ESA regulations to be slashed, want species to be delisted legislatively, are very concentrated in particular industries with very clear profit motives, it's easier for them to organize. It's easier for them to sort of speak with a unified voice, and that's the challenge, I think, of for the citizens and for the organizations that want to stand up and defend the ESA, is to not take it for granted, to not assume that someone else is kind of watching out for these issues, even though there are a lot of great organizations doing great work. But I think our voices need to be as loud and as unified as the voices on the other side. And so, I think making sure that you correspond with or call your legislators and make sure they know that you value the ESA and do not want to see it interfered with. Make sure that you join, support, donate to one of the many organizations that are doing the difficult work of both doing the organizing on the ground, but also fighting in Congress and at the regulatory agencies to make sure the ESA doesn't get dismantled by this administration.
Absolutely. So, Nick, you mentioned earlier the work of author and philosopher Peter Singer and his role perhaps in you rethinking your relationship with eating meat. But Singer was really calling for a different kind of relationship with animals. Maybe you can talk about what that might look to you.
So I have to admit that I've, since my high school days, my thinking has evolved a little bit. And I think that Peter Singer, makes a really compelling argument from kind of within the internal logic of utilitarianism, let's say. But I don't find that to be like a totally satisfactory way to account for the value of animals or the value of non-human life in general. I think from his point of view, the reduction or avoidance of suffering is kind of the end goal, which I think lines up very well with veganism and with the urgent need to stop factory farming and the unimaginable quantity of animals that are suffering due to industrial agriculture every day. But where I don't think that kind of frame lines up very well is, for instance, in the context of wildlife. I think that there are kind of questions about intrinsic value and about value that goes beyond individual suffering or individual pleasure that are precious, and that society, we enacted the ESA, we care about biodiversity, and those are values that don't translate that cleanly into utilitarian terms, I don't think.
All right. And simply for wildlife, the idea of existence values, that they're valuable just to exist on the landscape in a non-utilitarian way, that's become a very important argument, I think, for those who want to protect wild creatures.
Absolutely. And I think, it's important to make all the arguments at your disposal. Certainly there's a powerful, and I think the most powerful case for endangered species protection and for just conservation generally is one that appeals to that sense of intrinsic value and that sense of kind of like wonder and preservation of something that is just kind of fundamentally significant. But that is not persuasive to some people. And I think there are other, more utilitarian or more economic benefits as well that are associated with, the conservation of species and ecosystems. And, to talk about Yellowstone grizzly bears, for instance, right? Like the sort of value of their presence to the local economy, I think is incredibly significant. And in a world where they were not there, where, you could not have photographers and guides and tourists kind of coming to Yellowstone to have the opportunity to view these animals, I think it would be fairly devastating to the local economy. And so, that's also true. And I think a combination of both the more sort of, not cynical, but the more utilitarian arguments and the more deontological ones is an important part of a well-balanced philosophical diet when you're dealing with these issues. Right.
So, Nick, you're in court every day and fighting for wild creatures, or actually not wild creatures, just creatures generally. Are you optimistic that we as a society are going to develop a different kind of relationship with animals?
I see signs that are encouraging. Sometimes I have to squint a little bit, but I think there are developments that are really great. We just talked about the movement away from the use of fur. Right. I think there is a tremendous change coming with also, like we discussed before, the sort of clean meats and sort of growing acceptance of food sources that do not require cruelty to produce, but that also are like delicious things that you would actually want to eat. I think there is kind of a lot of entrepreneurship being married with activism in a way that's driving a lot of change right now, and that I'm encouraged by.
That's great. Well, thank you, Nick. Thanks for joining us. You're listening to Nick Arrivo with the Humane Society of the United States. He's an attorney representing the grizzly bear in court and its protection. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been great.